Hey everyone, John Chappell again, and in this PowerPoint we begin to look directly at the Nixon administration's handling of the war in Vietnam, and we're going to go up just as far as the tragic shootings at Kent State University in May 1970. So let's get started. You know from the Olson and Roberts reading that aside from Nixon himself, obviously, the person most influential in shaping Vietnam War policy was Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger's appointment marked a dramatic expansion in just the visibility and the influence of this role of national security advisor. Kissinger's family, Jews who had fled Nazi Germany during the 30s, immigrated to the United States. Kissinger had been a lecturer at Harvard University, where he taught international relations. An extremely ambitious person, he and Nixon were very different personalities, didn't always get along, but they shared an outlook in terms of broader goals of American foreign policy. And within that broader framework specifically, they were in sync and in agreement that the United States had to extricate itself from the war in Vietnam. But they also shared the belief that this had to be done in a way that didn't look like a defeat. Another significant step Nixon took was to revise the draft. He did away with student deferments and implemented what became known as a lottery draft system in 1969, and you see this picture from the first lottery drawing in December of 1969. So every date on the calendar was given a number, and officials would reach into this bowl, pull out a blue plastic container and open it and say your birthday was June 25th. They said, June 25th, your number is 3751. If you had a lower draft number like that and your birthday was June 25th, you knew your chances were pretty good of being drafted. These measures drastically increased the number of Americans fleeing to Canada to escape the draft. I go into more detail about this in the information included as part of the Flying Burrito Brothers song that you're listening to this week, My Uncle, which is a song about that topic of going to Canada to avoid the draft. It was a significant development of the Vietnam War era, very difficult, painful decision made by thousands and thousands of young American men who made that choice. How many Americans fled to Canada, we don't exactly know. Estimates on the low end are usually around 30,000, upper end as high as 100 to 125,000. This is the largest exodus of Americans to Canada since the American Revolution, when you had loyalists who opposed the American Revolution go to Canada and remain loyal to the British Empire. It's a significant development during the period of Nixon's presidency. The anti-war movement was able to regroup and rebuild in the aftermath of Chicago. And collectively, what the movement did was to move away from the protest to resistance rhetoric of 67, 68, and rebuild itself toward demonstrations of a peaceful nature that were community-based and could draw in more people and that way reflect changing public opinion about the war. And it's amazing in the aftermath of Chicago, especially, that the anti-war movement was able to regroup as successfully as it did. And its plans for 1969 revolved around a concept called the moratoriums, which is a term that means really a suspension of your normal daily activities. The idea was to have one of these in October, one in November. They would be staged in cities across the United States, and specifically the planning involved medium and even smaller sized communities. The hope was for a turnout of millions of Americans to show their dissent with the war. These demonstrations caused tremendous concern among Nixon and members of his administration. The first moratorium in October, tremendously successful. Millions of Americans took part. Companies even gave employees the day off to participate. You see in this photograph a picture of the large crowd in Washington, D.C. But literally millions of Americans participated in this first moratorium in October. And so Richard Nixon, who, as I mentioned, was very concerned about this, strikes back with the most famous speech of his presidency, the silent majority speech of 1969. You're going to watch an excerpt from a documentary on the 60s that talks about this speech. You're going to read part of it and watch an excerpt, just a minute, from the conclusion of the speech itself, and be engaging in discussion about that. So I don't want to go into great detail thematically here about what Nixon is trying to do with the speech. I'm going to wait till we have our online discussion for that. The other thing I do want to mention in connection with this is where Nixon unveils what he calls his plan of Vietnamization for the war. That is, turning over responsibility for fighting the war back to the South Vietnamese. And Nixon announces he's going to begin a phased withdrawal of American forces. This was very popular with the American public, but was going to prove disastrous for the American military. I mean, think about it. You're keeping the draft in place. You've taken away student deferments. But now you're asking young Americans to be drafted, fight, potentially die in a war that you're withdrawing from at the same time. It's no surprise that attitudinally, the outlook of Americans fighting in Vietnam changes drastically from 1969 on. They become much more skeptical and even outright cynical about the war. I mean, keeping yourself alive, surviving your tour becomes the paramount objective. All sorts of problems crop up in relation to this. People disobeying orders, just outright, especially by 1971 into 72, became rampant. Drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam increased exponentially. A drug trade, by the way, that many top officials in the South Vietnamese government were actually involved in. So you had people in South Vietnam's government profiting from American soldiers becoming addicts during the Vietnam War. Just another example of the awful nature of South Vietnam's government. So, as I said, this was popular with the American public, but is going to create very difficult conditions for the American military to continue the war. Nixon's speech was well received, plenty of positive response from Americans. You see a pile of letters and telegrams on Nixon's desk in the Oval Office. It's true that Nixon's campaign team, which was already thinking ahead to 1972, inflated these totals by creating a lot of fake letters and telegrams as well. So Nixon makes a mistake here of thinking that positive response to his silent majority speech means Americans will support his controversial decision to send American troops into the neighboring country of Cambodia to attack areas that the Viet Cong had been using as staging areas and storage areas for supplies. So, a violation of Cambodia's neutrality. Cambodia was officially neutral in the war, but American actions in Cambodia, the combination of this invasion, the American secret bombing of Cambodia, which Nixon had implemented and was going to come to light eventually, these things are going to destabilize Cambodia, leading to political upheaval and tragedy there later when this fanatical dictator, Pol Pot, comes to power and implements a sustained period of genocide. So this move was deeply unpopular with members of Congress and with the American public, who saw it as an expansion of a war that Nixon had just said he was going to scale back. Cambodia's invasion, the invasion of Cambodia prompted renewed protests on college campuses around the country, and tragedy strikes at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, Northeast Ohio in May 1970. Kent State, like many college campuses, had seen an increase in demonstrations against the war, and the governor there, James Rhodes, brought the National Guard to campus as a visible indication of his determination to restore order on college campuses in the state of Ohio. The particular day of the shooting was a day, this actually happened during finals week at Kent State, and there had been an anti-war rally in a central kind of quad area, and during that there had been some confrontations and scuffles at the edge of the crowd between guardsmen and students, but the rally continued. It was of a peaceful nature. It ended, students were dispersing. This was between classes, so students were going to classes or going between classes. Guardsmen started marching away, and for reasons that have never been fully explained, despite several official investigations, one contingent of guardsmen wheels around and suddenly opens fire into this very crowded commons area. 4 students were killed, 9 wounded. This is the most famous photograph to come out of the Kent State shootings. A teenager, Marianne Vecchio, kneeling over the body of one of the victims, Jeffrey Miller. She was actually a teenage runaway whose parents didn't even know where she was until they saw this photograph of her. So the shootings at Kent State sparked renewed demonstrations and protests on campuses all across the country. Many campuses that had seen very little anti-war activity suddenly exploded with student demonstrations. University of Kentucky is an example of that. And as I note on this slide, student protests happened at Webster College, as it was known then, here in St. Louis as well. And also noteworthy, coming out of Kent State, singer-songwriter Neil Young, a Canadian, read an article in Life magazine about the shootings, and it prompted him to compose a song called Ohio, which was immediately recorded by the group Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, a band that had first appeared in 1969 as Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but Stephen Stills and Neil Young had been in the group Buffalo Springfield, whose song For What It's Worth you listened to a couple weeks ago. And Neil Young was in and out of this band various times over the years, but they recorded this and released it as a single in 1970, kind of the equivalent, I guess, of getting commentary out on social media today. They got this out fairly quickly, and it actually wasn't available on an album for a few years, but the 45 became a hit and offered a strong take on the shootings at Kent State, tragedy there, and even called out Richard Nixon directly by name. For college students of this generation, Kent State was a jarring incident that made many students feel there was no safe place for them anymore.